The summer sun had been unforgiving the day Delilah Barrett arrived in Cottonwood Springs, a dusty frontier town nestled in the heart of Wyoming territory. It was 1879, and the West was still wild, untamed, and full of promises that often went unfulfilled. Wiping the sweat from her brow, she gazed at the weathered farmhouse that was to be her new home, wondering if she'd made a terrible mistake in accepting her uncle's offer to take over his property after his passing. Delilah was 23, unmarried, and had left behind the comforts of Boston society following the financial ruin of her family. Her uncle's unexpected bequest had seemed like divine providence, until she laid eyes on the neglected homestead with its creaking porch, overgrown fields, and ancient barn that looked like it might collapse in the next strong breeze. "It ain't much," said the stagecoach driver who delivered her, "but it's good land, better than most." "Thank you," Delilah replied, straightening her shoulders as the man deposited her trunks on the dusty ground. She would not show weakness, not here in this untamed place where she suspected weakness was considered a fatal flaw. The driver tipped his hat. "Town's 'bout 3 miles west if you need anything. Good luck to you, Miss Barrett." As the stagecoach disappeared in a cloud of dust, Delilah stood alone, the vast Wyoming landscape stretching around her in all directions. She'd never felt so small, so utterly alone, but she was determined to make this work. She had nowhere else to go. The first night in her uncle's house was unsettling. Wind whistled through cracks in the walls, and unfamiliar sounds from the surrounding wilderness kept her awake until dawn. By morning, Delilah had compiled a mental list of repairs needed to make the place habitable. She'd just finished a meager breakfast when the sound of approaching hoofbeats drew her attention. Cautiously, she stepped onto the porch, shading her eyes against the morning sun. A tall figure on horseback approached, and Delilah tensed, acutely aware of her vulnerability. The rider stopped a respectful distance from the house and removed his hat. He was younger than she'd expected, perhaps in his late 20s, with sun-bronzed skin and eyes the color of the Wyoming sky. "Morning, madam," he called. "Name's Isaac Adler. I work the ranch bordering yours to the north." Delilah hesitated before responding. "Delilah Barrett, this was my uncle's property." Isaac nodded. "I heard of his passing. My condolences." He seemed to be assessing her, taking in her city clothes and smooth hands that had never known hard labor. "I knew your uncle well. Good man." "Thank you," Delilah replied, wondering what this stranger wanted. As if reading her thoughts, Isaac continued, "I noticed your arrival yesterday. Thought I'd ride over and offer any help you might need. Homesteading ain't easy, especially for someone." He trailed off, perhaps thinking better of whatever he'd been about to say. "Especially for a woman alone," Delilah finished for him, a hint of challenge in her voice. Isaac had the grace to look slightly embarrassed. "Especially for anyone without experience, madam." "These lands can be unforgiving." Delilah considered his offer. Pride urged her to refuse, to prove she could manage on her own, but practicality won out. "The water pump seems to be broken," she admitted, "and I'm not sure about the condition of the barn." Isaac dismounted with an easy grace that spoke of a lifetime spent on horseback. "I can take a look at that pump right away. As for the barn..." He glanced toward the weathered structure. "It's seen better days, but it stood through 20 Wyoming winters. Might just need some reinforcement." Over the next few hours, Isaac fixed the water pump, examined the barn's foundation, and gave Delilah a brief lesson on operating the ancient stove in the kitchen. His manner was respectful but reserved, offering assistance without condescension. "Your uncle kept some tools in the shed behind the house," Isaac explained as they walked the property. "They're rusty but serviceable. There's about 40 acres of workable land here, though it hasn't been plowed in a while. Delilah felt overwhelmed. I don't know the first thing about farming. Isaac glanced at her. What did you plan to do with the place? I hadn't thought that far ahead, Delilah admitted. I just knew I needed to start over somewhere new. Something in her tone must have revealed more than she intended, for Isaac nodded in understanding. Running from something. Starting fresh, Delilah corrected, unwilling to share the humiliation of her family's fall from grace in Boston society. Isaac didn't press. Well, Miss Barrett, if you're planning to stay, you've got decisions to make. You could sell the place, though land prices have fallen since the panic of '73. You could try to work it yourself, but that's back-breaking labor even for someone with experience. Or you could hire help. I don't have the funds to hire anyone, Delilah said, the admission costing her pride. Isaac considered this. There's a third option. Many homesteaders around here work together during planting and harvest. Everyone helps everyone else. No money changes hands, just labor. And would the good people of Cottonwood Springs be willing to help a stranger? They might, Isaac said, especially if someone vouched for you. Before Delilah could respond, a distant rumble of thunder interrupted their conversation. Isaac glanced at the darkening sky. Storm's coming in fast. You'd best secure any livestock and check the roof for leaks. I haven't seen any livestock, Delilah said with a frown. Uncle Joseph's letter mentioned chickens and a milk cow. Isaac's expression turned grim. Might be someone helped themselves after your uncle passed. It happens. As if to punctuate his statement, rain began to fall, fat droplets that quickly increased in intensity. I need to get back to my ranch, Isaac said, pulling his hat lower. Will you be all right here? Delilah nodded, though inwardly she felt a flutter of anxiety at being left alone as the storm intensified. I'll manage. Thank you for your help today, Mr. Adler. Isaac, he corrected with a slight smile. Neighbors shouldn't stand on formality out here. He mounted his horse with practiced ease. I'll stop by tomorrow to check on you if that's all right. That would be appreciated, Delilah said, surprised by how much she meant it. As Isaac rode away through the increasing rain, Delilah hurried inside the farmhouse. She spent the evening listening to rain hammer against the roof and discovering new leaks that required strategically placed buckets. The house felt even lonelier than the night before, but now she had a neighbor's imminent return to look forward to. It was a small comfort, but in this vast wilderness, Delilah would take whatever comfort she could find. True to his word, Isaac returned the following morning. The sky had cleared, leaving behind a washed-clean brilliance that made the distant mountains seem close enough to touch. He brought with him a small crate of provisions, coffee, flour, salt, and sugar, along with half a dozen chickens in a makeshift cage. I can spare these, he said when Delilah tried to refuse the gifts. Consider it a welcome to the territory. Over the next few weeks, a routine developed. Isaac would ride over every few days, helping Delilah repair the farmhouse and teaching her the basics of maintaining a homestead. Under his guidance, she learned to mend fences, care for the chickens, and identify edible plants that grew wild on her property. In return, Delilah insisted on cooking for him whenever he visited. Her culinary skills were limited to what she'd observed in her family's kitchen in Boston, but Isaac seemed genuinely appreciative of any hot meal that wasn't his own cooking. "This is mighty fine," he said one evening as they sat at her kitchen table, sharing a rabbit stew Delilah had prepared. "Been a while since I've eaten anything I didn't cook myself." "You never mentioned family," Delilah ventured. "Do you live alone on your ranch?" Isaac nodded, his expression carefully neutral. "My father passed 3 years ago, left me the ranch. My mother died when I was young, and I have no siblings." "I'm sorry," Delilah said softly. "It must be lonely." "You get used to it," Isaac replied with a shrug that didn't quite convince. "The work keeps me busy. Not much time for feeling lonely." But there was something in his eyes that suggested otherwise, a flicker of the same solitude Delilah felt in the quiet evenings when the only sounds were the creaking of the house and the distant howl of coyotes. As summer progressed, Delilah began to feel more at home in Cottonwood Springs. Isaac introduced her to neighboring homesteaders who welcomed her with varying degrees of warmth. Some, like elderly Mrs. Whitaker from the adjacent farm to the east, were immediately friendly, bringing freshly baked bread and offering practical advice about surviving Wyoming winters. Others were more reserved, eyeing Delilah's Eastern manners and speech with suspicion. "They'll come around," Isaac assured her after a particularly awkward encounter with the stern-faced Peterson family. "Folks out here just take time to warm up to newcomers." "Because newcomers often don't last," Delilah guessed. Isaac's slight smile confirmed her suspicion. "The territory weeds out those who aren't committed. They've seen plenty of Easterners arrive full of romantic notions about the frontier, only to give up when they realize how hard the life is." "And is that what you think will happen to me?" Delilah challenged. Isaac studied her for a long moment. "No," he said finally. "You've got grit, Delilah Barrett, more than most." The compliment warmed her unexpectedly, and she busied herself with adjusting her bonnet to hide the flush that crept into her cheeks. With Isaac's help, Delilah managed to plant a small vegetable garden behind the house. The work was backbreaking hours spent turning the soil, removing stones, and carefully placing seeds in the freshly prepared ground, but there was satisfaction in watching the first green shoots emerge. "There's nothing quite like eating vegetables you've grown yourself," Isaac told her as they knelt side by side in the garden, thinning out the radish seedlings. "Store-bought never tastes the same." Delilah found herself watching him as he worked, noticing the careful precision of his movements despite his large, calloused hands. Isaac Adler was a contradictory man, quiet but not unfriendly, reserved but unfailingly kind. Unlike the men she'd known in Boston, he spoke plainly and kept his word. There was no artifice to him, no hidden agenda in his assistance. It was refreshing. And increasingly, Delilah found herself looking forward to his visits with an eagerness that went beyond simple gratitude for his help. By August, the vegetable garden was flourishing, and Delilah had established herself well enough that she ventured into town alone for supplies. Cottonwood Springs was a small settlement, one main street with a general store, saloon, blacksmith, and a handful of other businesses. The arrival of the railroad 2 years prior had brought some growth, but it was still a frontier town at heart. At the general store, Delilah was selecting fabric for curtains when she overheard 2 women discussing her in hushed, but clearly audible tones. "That's Joseph Barrett's niece," one whispered. "The one from back east, living all alone out at the old Barrett place." "Not entirely alone, from what I hear," the other replied with a meaningful inflection. "Isaac Adler's been riding out there regular as clockwork. Spending an awful lot of time helping a neighbor, if you ask me." "Well, she's unmarried and pretty enough in that refined way. Man gets lonely." Delilah felt her cheeks burn with indignation and embarrassment. Before she could decide whether to confront the gossips or retreat, a firm voice interrupted. "Ladies, if you've got nothing better to do than spread tales, perhaps you could help Mrs. Finch organize the church social next Sunday. She's looking for volunteers." The women scattered like startled hens. Delilah turned to find herself face to face with a tall, silver-haired woman whose bearing suggested she was accustomed to authority. "Don't mind them," the woman said. Small towns run on gossip like engines run on coal. I'm Margaret Preston, the doctor's wife. Delilah Barrett, she replied, extending her hand. Thank you for intervening. Margaret shook her hand firmly. Isaac Adler is one of the finest men in the territory. Don't let anyone tarnish his reputation or yours with idle speculation. Delilah felt a need to clarify. Mr. Adler has been a kind neighbor, nothing more. Something knowing flickered in Margaret's eyes. Of course. Now, are you planning to attend the social on Sunday? It would be a good opportunity for you to meet more of the community. Delilah hesitated. She hadn't participated in any social events since arriving, too focused on making her uncle's property habitable. I hadn't thought about it. You should come, Margaret encouraged. Bring something for the potluck if you can, and don't worry about those two. She nodded toward the retreating gossips. Most folks around here are decent enough once they get to know you. The church social presented a dilemma for Delilah. She wanted to establish herself in the community, but the prospect of facing more whispers and sidelong glances was daunting. When Isaac visited the following day to help repair a sagging section of the barn roof, she mentioned the encounter at the general store. I'm sorry about that, he said, looking genuinely troubled. I never thought about how my visits might affect your reputation. It's not your fault, Delilah assured him, but perhaps we should be more circumspect. Isaac was quiet for a long moment. If you'd prefer I not visit as often, no, Delilah interrupted, surprising herself with her vehemence. That's not what I meant at all. I value your friendship. I just don't want to be the subject of town gossip. Friendship, Isaac repeated, his expression unreadable. Yes, of course. There was an awkward silence, broken only by the distant call of a meadowlark. Margaret Preston suggested I attend the church social on Sunday, Delilah said, changing the subject. Do you think I should go? Isaac seemed to consider this carefully. The Prestons are good people. If Margaret's taken an interest in you, that'll help with your standing in town. He hesitated before adding, I could escort you if you'd like. Might quiet some of the gossip if we're seen together in public properly. The offer touched Delilah deeply. Thank you. I'd appreciate that. The Sunday social was held on the church grounds, with tables laden with food set up under the shade of ancient cottonwood trees. Isaac arrived at Delilah's farm punctually, wearing a clean shirt and his least weathered hat. He'd even trimmed his beard. Delilah noticed with a flutter of something she wasn't ready to examine too closely. For her part, Delilah wore her second-best dress, a blue cotton with white piping that she'd altered to follow the simpler frontier styles. She'd brought a wild blackberry cobbler, made with berries Isaac had helped her gather from bushes along the creek that ran through her property. The social was both better and worse than Delilah had anticipated. Margaret Preston made a point of introducing her to the more influential members of the community, including her husband, the town's only doctor, and the mayor, a former cavalry officer named Elliot. Many were welcoming, particularly after learning she intended to work her uncle's land rather than sell it to the cattle companies that were buying up small homesteads throughout the territory. We need more committed farmers, Mayor Elliot told her. Too many folks giving up and selling out to the big outfits changes the character of a community. Others were less friendly, particularly a group of women who watched Delilah and Isaac with undisguised curiosity. Their whispers followed the pair as they moved through the gathering. Don't pay them any mind, Isaac murmured when he noticed Delilah's discomfort. They'll find something else to talk about soon enough. But it wasn't just the gossips who drew Delilah's attention. A tall, imposing man in an expensive suit watched them from across the churchyard, his gaze calculating. When he finally approached, Isaac stiffened almost imperceptibly beside her. Miss Barrett, the man said, tipping his hat. Victor Thornton, I own the Double T Ranch south of your property." "Mr. Thornton," Delilah acknowledged with a nod. "I understand you've taken over Joseph Barrett's homestead," Thornton continued. "That's a considerable undertaking for a single woman." Before Delilah could respond, Isaac spoke up. "Miss Barrett is doing just fine." Thornton's smile didn't reach his eyes. "I'm sure she is, with your assistance, Adler." He returned his attention to Delilah. "If you ever decide the burden is too much, I'd be interested in purchasing your land. I'd offer a fair price, more than you'd get from anyone else around here." "I'm not interested in selling, Mr. Thornton," Delilah said firmly. Something hardened in Thornton's expression. "You might change your mind when winter comes. It gets mighty cold and lonely out here." He nodded to them both. "Enjoy the social." As he walked away, Delilah turned to Isaac. "What was that about?" "Victor Thornton has been buying up small homesteads all across the county," Isaac explained, his voice low. "He's got ambitions to be the biggest cattle baron in the territory. Your uncle refused to sell to him while he was alive, which didn't sit well with Thornton. And now he thinks I'll be easier to convince." "He thinks you're vulnerable," Isaac corrected. "A woman alone, new to the territory. He doesn't know you yet." Despite the encounter with Thornton, the social proved valuable for Delilah. She made connections with other homesteaders who promised to include her in the cooperative harvest efforts Isaac had mentioned. Several women invited her to join their quilting circle, which met weekly at different homes throughout the area. By the time Isaac escorted her home, the sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks that reflected off the distant mountains. They rode in comfortable silence, Delilah on a gentle mare Isaac had lent her for the occasion. "Thank you for today," Delilah said as they approached her farmhouse. "I appreciate you accompanying me." Isaac smiled, the expression softening his weathered features. "It was my pleasure." He hesitated, then added, "You handled Thornton well. Most newcomers get intimidated by him." "I've dealt with men like him before," Delilah replied, thinking of the creditors who'd circled her family in Boston, waiting to pick over the remains of their fortune. Men who mistake politeness for weakness. They reached the farmyard, and Isaac helped Delilah dismount, his hands strong and sure at her waist. For a moment, they stood close, too close for propriety, and Delilah found herself noticing details she'd overlooked before. The tiny flecks of gold in his blue eyes, the small scar at the corner of his mouth, the way his hands lingered a heartbeat longer than necessary. Then Isaac stepped back, clearing his throat. "I should get going. It's a fair ride back to my place." Delilah nodded, suddenly aware of the rapid beating of her heart. "Of course. Thank you again." As she watched him ride away, Delilah acknowledged the truth she'd been avoiding for weeks. She was developing feelings for Isaac Adler that went far beyond neighborly gratitude. It was inconvenient, potentially complicated, and entirely unexpected. And yet, as she entered her solitary house, she couldn't help but wonder if he might feel the same. The days grew shorter as summer gave way to fall. The vegetable garden yielded a surprisingly bountiful harvest, enough that Delilah was able to preserve a good amount for the coming winter. With Isaac's guidance, she learned to can tomatoes and green beans, to dry herbs, and to store root vegetables in the cool, dark cellar beneath the house. Isaac continued to visit regularly, though there was a new undercurrent to their interactions, a careful distance that hadn't been there before, as if they were both conscious of crossing an invisible boundary. Their conversations remained friendly but rarely strayed into personal territory, focusing instead on the practical matters of preparing the homestead for winter. "The barn needs reinforcement before the snow comes," Isaac said during one such visit in early October. They were walking the property, assessing what remained to be done. "That northwest corner won't hold through a blizzard." "Is there time?" Delilah asked, eyeing the weathered structure with concern. "If we start soon, I can bring some of my men over next week. Between us, we should be able to get it done in a day or two." "I can't ask you to do that," Delilah protested. "You've already done so much." Isaac's expression was serious. "Delilah, a Wyoming winter is nothing to take lightly. If that barn collapses, you lose your storage for hay and a shelter for any livestock. In the worst case, you could lose the house too if the fire spreads." The gravity of his warning sobered Delilah. "Very well. I accept your help, but I insist on paying your men for their labor. They work for me. I'll handle their wages." "Isaac, we can discuss it later," he said in a tone that suggested the matter was settled for now. "There's something else we need to address. You need more firewood. A lot more." By the following week, Isaac had organized a work party consisting of himself, 3 of his ranch hands, and 2 neighboring farmers who owed him favors. They arrived at dawn, tools loaded in wagons, along with lumber Isaac had purchased in town. Delilah spent the day cooking for the men, bringing out coffee and biscuits mid-morning and preparing a hearty stew for their midday meal. It was strange having so many people on her property after months of solitude, but there was something heartening about the sounds of hammers and saws, the good-natured banter between the workers. Isaac supervised the work with quiet authority, demonstrating a knowledge of construction that Delilah hadn't realized he possessed. By sunset, the barn's weakest sections had been reinforced with fresh timber, the roof patched, and the doors were hung to close more securely. As the other men departed, Isaac remained behind to check the work one final time. Delilah joined him in the barn, now filled with the clean scent of fresh-cut pine. "It looks sturdy enough to withstand anything," she observed, running her hand along a newly installed support beam. "It'll hold," Isaac agreed. "We'll need to do more extensive repairs come spring, but this will see you through the winter." Delilah turned to him, suddenly overwhelmed by the enormity of his kindness. "I don't know how to thank you properly. Everything you've done. I wouldn't have survived out here without your help." Isaac shook his head. "You're stronger than you give yourself credit for. You'd have managed, perhaps, but I'm grateful I didn't have to find out the hard way." On impulse, Delilah reached out and took his hand. "Truly, Isaac, thank you." For a long moment they stood in the dimming light of the barn, hands joined, the air between them charged with unspoken feelings. Then Isaac gently squeezed her fingers before releasing them. "I should go," he said, his voice rough. "It'll be dark soon." As he turned to leave, Delilah called after him. "Will you come to dinner tomorrow as a proper thank you?" Isaac paused in the doorway, silhouetted against the sunset. "I'd like that." The dinner was simple roast chicken with vegetables from Delilah's garden, but she took special care with the preparation, using the last of her hoarded spices to enhance the flavors. She wore her best dress, a dark green wool that complemented her auburn hair, which she'd arranged more carefully than usual. Isaac arrived precisely at the appointed hour, freshly shaven and wearing a clean white shirt under his worn leather vest. He'd brought a bottle of whiskey, a luxury in the territory, and a small pouch of hard candies. "The whiskey's for both of us," he explained as he handed them over. "The candies are for you. Thought you might appreciate something sweet." The gesture touched Delilah deeply. Sweets were expensive and difficult to come by in Cottonwood Springs, and the fact that Isaac had thought of her preference for them showed an attentiveness she hadn't expected. They ate by lamplight, the conversation flowing more easily than it had in weeks. Isaac spoke of his father, a former Union soldier who'd claimed the homestead right after the war, building it from nothing into a modestly successful cattle ranch. Delilah, in turn, shared stories of her childhood in Boston, though she carefully avoided mentioning her family's subsequent financial ruin. As they lingered over coffee laced with Isaac's whiskey, the barriers between them seemed to dissolve. "Why did you really come to Wyoming, Delilah?" Isaac asked, his tone gentle but direct. There must have been easier options than taking over an isolated homestead. Delilah hesitated, then decided that if anyone deserved the truth, it was this man who had shown her such consistent kindness. "My father made some poor investments before he died. The panic of '73 wiped out what remained of our fortune. My mother passed shortly after from pneumonia, though I think it was really from the shock of our reduced circumstances." Isaac listened without interruption as she continued. "I was working as a companion to an elderly widow when I received word of Uncle Joseph's death and his bequest. The alternative was marriage to a much older gentleman who had been persistent in his attentions and had offered to settle my father's remaining debts in exchange for my hand." She smiled ruefully. Wyoming seemed the less oppressive option. "And now," Isaac asked, "do you regret your choice?" Delilah considered the question seriously. "There are days when I miss certain comforts of my previous life, hot baths that I don't have to haul and heat the water for, bookshops, theater performances." She looked around the small kitchen at the home she'd gradually made her own. "But no, I don't regret coming here. There's a freedom in this life I never knew before." "Freedom can be lonely," Isaac observed quietly. Their eyes met across the table, and Delilah felt a jolt of recognition he understood, perhaps better than anyone, the double-edged nature of independence. "It doesn't have to be," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. Isaac held her gaze for a long moment, something unreadable in his expression. Then he glanced at the clock on the mantel and rose from his chair. "It's getting late. I should head back." Disappointment washed over Delilah, though she knew his departure was proper. They weren't courting, at least not officially, and for him to remain longer would be inappropriate. She walked him to the door where he paused, hat in hand. "Thank you for dinner. It was the best meal I've had in a long time." "You're welcome anytime," Delilah said, meaning it. Isaac seemed about to say something more, but instead placed his hat on his head and nodded. "Good night, Delilah." "Good night, Isaac." As the door closed behind him, Delilah leaned against it, feeling a curious mixture of contentment and yearning. Something had shifted between them tonight, but whether it would lead to anything more remained uncertain. The first significant snowfall came in mid-November, blanketing the landscape in pristine white. Delilah woke to a transformed world, the familiar contours of her property softened and muted. It was beautiful but isolating, and for the first time since summer, she felt the true remoteness of her situation. The snow continued intermittently for days, sometimes falling gently, other times driving horizontally on fierce winds that howled around the corners of the house. Delilah kept the fire burning constantly and discovered new drafts that needed stuffing with rags. The barn, thankfully, remained solid, sheltering her small collection of livestock, the chickens, 2 goats she'd purchased from Mrs. Whitaker, and a sturdy pony Isaac had helped her acquire for transportation. A week into the snowfall, Delilah was beginning to worry about her dwindling supply of fresh food when she heard the now familiar sound of Isaac's horse approaching. Looking out the window, she saw him making his way carefully through the snow, leading a second horse laden with supplies. She rushed to open the door, relief flooding through her at the sight of him. "Isaac, I wasn't sure if you'd be able to make it through the snow." "It's not too deep yet," he said, stomping his boots to remove excess snow before entering. "I wanted to check on you, make sure you were managing all right." I'm fine, though I was starting to wonder how long before the roads would be passable again. Isaac began unloading supplies, a sack of flour, sugar, coffee, and, to Delilah's surprise, several books. "Thought you might want something to read during the long evenings," he explained when he saw her expression. "Got them from Doc Preston's wife. She said you can keep them as long as you need." The thoughtfulness of the gesture brought unexpected tears to Delilah's eyes, which she quickly blinked away. "That's very kind. Please thank her for me when you see her." They spent the afternoon together, Isaac checking the house and barn for any issues the snow might have caused, while Delilah prepared a hot meal for them both. The domesticity of it felt natural, as if they'd been sharing such days for years rather than months. As evening approached, Isaac reluctantly prepared to leave. "I should get back before dark. The temperature drops fast once the sun goes down." Delilah glanced out the window at the heavy gray sky. "Are you sure you should go? The weather looks like it might worsen." "I've ridden through worse," Isaac assured her. "I'll be fine." But 3 days later, the blizzard that had been threatening finally arrived in full force. Wind screamed across the plains, driving snow so thick that visibility dropped to mere feet. Delilah huddled inside, grateful for Isaac's foresight in helping her prepare but worried about his own safety. Had he made it back to his ranch before the worst hit? Was he, like her, waiting out the storm alone? By the second day of the blizzard, Delilah was growing restless. She'd read halfway through one of Margaret Preston's books, Baked Bread, and mended every piece of clothing that needed repair. The constant howl of the wind was wearing on her nerves, and she found herself imagining all manner of disaster befalling Isaac or her livestock. Late in the afternoon, she decided to check on the animals in the barn. Bundling up in layers of clothing, she tied a rope from the back door to the barn so she wouldn't lose her way in the whiteout conditions, then ventured into the storm. The short journey to the barn was harrowing. Wind-driven snow stung her face like needles, and the cold cut through her clothes despite the layers. By the time she reached the barn door, her fingers were numb despite her gloves. Inside, the animals were agitated but unharmed. Delilah spent time calming them, checking their food and water, and ensuring the structure remained sound. Satisfied that all was well, she prepared to return to the house. As she reached for the barn door, a strange smell caught her attention: smoke, but not from her chimney. Puzzled, she opened the door a crack and peered out. Through the swirling snow, she could see an orange glow coming from the hayloft window. Horror struck her as she realized what was happening. The barn was on fire. How it had started, she couldn't guess. Perhaps a stray ember from her earlier lantern, or spontaneous combustion in the hay itself. The cause didn't matter now, only the danger was real. Delilah's first thought was for the animals. She hurriedly began untying the goats, urging them toward the door, but they balked at the howling storm outside. The chickens were equally reluctant to leave their sheltered coop. The smoke was growing thicker, and now Delilah could hear the crackle of flames above her. Fear clutched at her throat as she realized the fire was spreading rapidly. Soon the entire hayloft would be ablaze, and the barn would become a death trap. She had to get out, but the thought of leaving the animals to burn was unbearable. Tears streaming down her face, Delilah made one more desperate attempt to drive the goats toward the door, but they only circled back to their stalls, bleating in confusion and fear. The smoke was becoming overwhelming, burning her lungs and making her eyes water. Delilah knew she had only moments before the flames broke through the loft floor. With one last anguished look at the animals, she stumbled toward the door, gasping for breath. Outside, the blizzard continued unabated, but now the snow glowed orange with reflected firelight. Delilah staggered a few steps from the barn, then fell to her knees in the snow. The rope that led back to the house had snapped or come loose. She couldn't see it anywhere in the swirling whiteness. Disoriented and choking on smoke, Delilah tried to determine which direction led to safety. But the combination of blizzard, smoke, and growing darkness made it impossible to get her bearings. Panic rose within her as she realized she might freeze to death mere yards from her own door. In desperation, she screamed for help, knowing even as she did that no one could possibly hear her above the storm, that no one would be foolish enough to be out in such weather, that she was utterly alone. The cold was seeping into her bones now, a dangerous lethargy beginning to overtake her. Some distant part of her mind recognized the symptoms of hypothermia, warned her that she needed to keep moving to find shelter, but her limbs felt leaden and unresponsive. As consciousness began to slip away, Delilah thought she heard a voice calling her name, a figure moving through the smoke and snow. But that was impossible. It must be a hallucination born of cold and fear. Then strong arms were around her, lifting her from the snow. Through half-closed eyes, Delilah saw Isaac's face, grim with determination as he carried her through the storm. "The animals," she tried to say, but her voice was barely a whisper. "Later," Isaac shouted above the wind. "You first." Somehow he found the house, kicking open the door and carrying Delilah inside. The warmth was a shock to her system, painful as sensation returned to her extremities. Isaac laid her gently on the sofa near the fire, quickly wrapping her in blankets before returning to close the door against the storm. "The barn," Delilah managed, her voice hoarse from smoke. "It's burning." "I know," Isaac said, kneeling beside her to check her for injuries. "There's nothing we can do now. The fire's too strong and the blizzard makes it impossible to fight." "How did you even get here?" Delilah asked, unable to comprehend his presence. "I was worried about you," he said simply. "When the blizzard hit, I knew you'd never faced one before. I tried to reach you yesterday but had to turn back. Today I made it through, thank God." The reality of her near-death experience suddenly hit Delilah, and she began to shake uncontrollably, tears spilling down her smoke-stained cheeks. Isaac held her close, murmuring reassurances as the storm raged and outside, her barn burned to the ground. Eventually, exhaustion overtook her, and Delilah drifted into an uneasy sleep, still wrapped in Isaac's protective embrace. She woke hours later to find the house quiet and the fire burning low. Isaac was seated in a chair nearby, his own eyes closed in sleep, his features softened in repose. Outside, the storm had subsided to gentle snowfall, the wild fury spent. Delilah shifted, and Isaac immediately came awake, alert and concerned. "How are you feeling?" "Better," she said, though her throat still burned from the smoke. "What time is it?" "Past midnight," Isaac replied, moving to add wood to the fire. "The worst of the blizzard seems to have passed." Memory rushed back: the barn, the fire, the animals. Did any of the animals survive? Isaac's expression was grave. "I'm sorry, Delilah. The barn is gone and the animals with it. There was nothing you could have done." Grief washed over her, not just for the animals but for all they represented. Her tentative success as a homesteader, her growing self-sufficiency, the future she'd begun to envision for herself in this harsh but beautiful land. "Everything I've worked for," she whispered. "It's all gone." "No," Isaac said firmly, coming to sit beside her. "The house is still standing, the land is still yours, and you're alive, Delilah. When I saw the flames through the snow, when I heard you scream." His voice caught. "I thought I'd lost you." The raw emotion in his words made Delilah look up sharply. Their eyes met, and in that moment, all the carefully maintained distance between them collapsed. "I can't lose you," Isaac said, his voice barely audible. "I don't want to imagine a life without you in it." Delilah reached for his hand, twining her fingers with his. "Then don't," she said simply. Isaac's kiss was gentle at first, a tentative question that Delilah answered by drawing him closer. All the feelings they'd kept restrained, all the longing disguised as neighborly concern, finally found expression in that embrace. When they eventually parted, Isaac rested his forehead against hers. "I've wanted to do that since the day you served me rabbit stew at your kitchen table." Delilah smiled despite everything. "I've wanted you to since the day you fixed my water pump." They spent the remainder of the night talking, planning, occasionally returning to each other's arms as if to reassure themselves that this newfound closeness was real. By dawn, they had made decisions that would alter both their lives irrevocably. "We'll rebuild the barn together," Isaac said as they watched the sunrise paint the snow-covered landscape in shades of pink and gold, bigger and stronger than before. "And in the spring, we'll merge our properties, yours and mine." "Is that a proposal, Isaac Adler?" Delilah asked, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "Not a very romantic one," he admitted. "You deserve better than that." He took her hands in his. "Delilah Barrett, I've loved you since I watched you stand on your porch that first day, determined to make a life here despite knowing nothing about homesteading. I love your courage, your intelligence, your stubborn pride. Will you marry me?" "Yes," Delilah answered without hesitation. "Yes, I will marry you." As soon as the roads were passable, Isaac rode into town to announce their engagement and to arrange for supplies to rebuild Delilah's barn. The news spread quickly through Cottonwood Springs, met with reactions ranging from heartfelt congratulations to knowing smirks from those who had gossiped about them all along. Victor Thornton was less pleased with the development. He cornered Isaac outside the general store, his displeasure evident in his sharp tone. "Clever move, Adler. Marry the Barrett girl and expand your holdings. I had my eye on that land." "This isn't about land," Isaac replied evenly. "And Delilah isn't a girl, she's a woman who's made her choice." Thornton's eyes narrowed. "We'll see how long that choice lasts when she realizes what she's in for. Frontier life breaks delicate eastern flowers like her." "You don't know Delilah at all if you think she's delicate," Isaac said, his voice hardening. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have supplies to purchase." The rebuff did nothing to improve Thornton's attitude. Over the coming weeks, as neighbors and friends helped rebuild Delilah's barn, there were small incidents: a wagon wheel mysteriously damaged, tools that went missing, rumors in town that questioned Delilah's character. Nothing could be traced directly to Thornton, but Isaac had no doubts about the source. "He's trying to drive us out," Delilah observed one evening as they reviewed the latest setback, a shipment of lumber that had been incorrectly routed to a town 50 miles away. "Or at least delay the rebuilding until I give up and sell." "He doesn't know who he's dealing with," Isaac said, his admiration evident. "Most women would have returned east by now, especially after the fire." Delilah smiled, a determined glint in her eye. "I'm not most women. And I'm not going anywhere." True to her word, Delilah threw herself into the rebuilding efforts with renewed vigor. She worked alongside the men, learning to handle tools, to measure and cut lumber, to raise beams. By day, she labored on the barn. By evening, she and Isaac planned their wedding and their future together. They were married on a bright spring day, with the mountains still snow-capped in the distance and the plains beginning to green with new growth. The ceremony was held in Cottonwood Springs' small church, followed by a celebration at the Prestons' home that brought together most of the community. Margaret Preston had taken Delilah under her wing during the preparations. offering practical advice about married life on the frontier that was far more useful than the vague instructions Delilah had received from her mother years ago. "Love is important," Margaret had told her the day before the wedding, "but so is partnership. Isaac will respect you more if you speak your mind and stand your ground when it matters." It was counsel Delilah took to heart as she and Isaac began their married life together. They divided their time between her homestead and his ranch, gradually integrating their operations. Isaac taught Delilah about cattle ranching while she expanded the vegetable gardens at both properties, applying the lessons she'd learned through trial and error the previous year. The new barn, completed just before their wedding, was indeed stronger and larger than its predecessor. This time, it housed not just chickens and goats but also 2 milk cows, a team of draft horses, and eventually, a small herd of sheep that Delilah decided to raise for wool. "Diversification," she explained to an amused Isaac when she proposed adding the sheep. "If the cattle market falters, we'll have other sources of income." "I married a businesswoman," Isaac said with a proud smile. "My father would have approved. Life wasn't without its challenges." Victor Thornton continued his campaign of minor harassments, though he was careful to keep them just on the legal side of the line. Water rights became a contentious issue when Thornton attempted to divert the creek that ran through multiple properties, including the Adlers. The dispute required intervention from the territorial courts and created tensions that divided the community. Through it all, Delilah and Isaac's partnership grew stronger. They faced each obstacle together, finding in each other the strength to persevere when circumstances seemed overwhelming. By the following winter, Delilah was expecting their first child. The pregnancy was both joyful and frightening. Medical care was limited in the territory, and childbirth remained dangerous, especially on isolated homesteads. "Perhaps you should stay in town as your time approaches," Isaac suggested one evening as they sat by the fire in what had been Delilah's house and was now their shared home. "The Prestons would take you in, and you'd be closer to the doctor." Delilah considered the idea. "I'd rather be here with you. We can arrange for Margaret to come stay with us when the time is near. She's attended more births than her husband, from what I hear." Isaac looked unconvinced. "It's risky, Delilah. If anything happened to you or the baby." "Nothing will happen," she assured him, though she couldn't know that for certain. "And if it does, we'll face it together. That's what we do, isn't it?" In the end, they compromised. As Delilah entered her final month, Margaret Preston came to stay, bringing with her decades of experience and a calm demeanor that reassured both expectant parents. Dr. Preston checked in every few days, despite the winter roads, and arranged to remain in Cottonwood Springs rather than making his usual circuit of outlying communities. The labor began on a clear, cold January night. Isaac, who had faced stampeding cattle and armed rustlers without flinching, found himself utterly terrified as Delilah's pains intensified. Margaret firmly sent him from the room, instructing him to boil water and prepare clean linens, tasks designed more to keep him occupied than out of actual necessity. For hours, Isaac paced the kitchen, flinching at every cry from the bedroom. When Margaret finally emerged, her expression gave away nothing. "Delilah?" Isaac asked, his voice breaking on the single word. "Exhausted but well," Margaret replied with a small smile, "and eager for you to meet your son." The relief that flooded through Isaac was so profound that his knees nearly buckled. He entered the bedroom to find Delilah propped up on pillows, her face drawn with fatigue but radiant as she cradled a small bundle in her arms. "Come meet Joseph," she said softly, revealing the tiny, red-faced infant named for her uncle who had made their meeting possible. Isaac sat carefully on the edge of the bed, overwhelmed by the sight of his wife and son. "He's perfect," he whispered, gently touching the baby's cheek. "And you are extraordinary." Delilah smiled, her eyes heavy with exhaustion but bright with joy. "We did it. We're a family now." As Margaret quietly left the room to give them privacy, Isaac stretched out beside Delilah, careful not to disturb her or the baby. Together, they marveled at the new life they had created, a tangible symbol of the love and partnership they had built in the harsh but rewarding Wyoming wilderness. Joseph Adler was just the beginning. Over the years that followed, Delilah and Isaac welcomed 3 more children, twin girls, Emma and Charlotte, and another son, William. Their combined properties flourished under their joint management, expanding to become one of the most successful mixed farming and ranching operations in the county. Victor Thornton's influence waned as more homesteaders refused his offers and formed cooperative associations to protect their water rights and grazing lands. Eventually, he sold his holdings and moved to California, leaving behind a community stronger for having stood against his attempted monopoly. Cottonwood Springs grew modestly with the arrival of the railroad, becoming a small but thriving town. Delilah, drawing on her Boston upbringing, helped establish a proper school and a library, ensuring her children and others would have educational opportunities despite their frontier location. On the 10th anniversary of the barn fire that had brought them together, Isaac and Delilah stood on their porch, watching their children play in the yard as the sun set behind the mountains. The property had transformed over the decade. The house expanded, the barn rebuilt and joined by additional outbuildings, the fields neatly fenced and productive. "You ever regret it?" Isaac asked, his arm around Delilah's waist. "Coming west, taking on this life?" Delilah leaned into his embrace, considering the question. "Not for a moment," she said with absolute certainty. "Everything that led me here, even the hardships, brought me to you, to our family, to this life we've built together. How could I regret that?" Isaac smiled, the lines around his eyes deepening, lines earned through years of working under the Wyoming sun, of laughter with his children, of facing life's challenges alongside the woman he loved. "When I carried you out of that blizzard," he said, "I was so afraid I'd lose you before I ever had the chance to tell you how I felt. I've thanked God every day since then for giving us that chance." Delilah turned to face him, her hands resting on his chest. "The fire destroyed so much, but it gave us everything that matters." As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, they remained on the porch, contemplating the journey that had brought them to this moment. From a chance meeting between a Boston society woman fallen on hard times and a Wyoming rancher with a kind heart, they had forged a love strong enough to weather the harshest frontier winters, to overcome the schemes of land-hungry neighbors, to build a legacy that would endure long after they were gone. In the distance, a coyote called, its haunting cry echoing across the plains, a reminder of the wildness that still existed at the edges of their carefully cultivated world. But here, in the circle of light cast from their home's windows, Delilah and Isaac had created something enduring, a life of purpose, a family bound by love, and a partnership that had transformed them both in ways they could never have imagined when their paths first crossed on a dusty Wyoming homestead all those years ago. The barn that had once gone up in flames now stood strong and tall against the horizon, a symbol of resilience and renewal, much like the love that had sparked in its ashes and grown into the foundation of their shared life. As night fell completely over the Wyoming plains, Delilah and Isaac Adler entered their home hand in hand, grateful for the fire that had nearly destroyed everything, but had instead given them everything that mattered.